named our daughter after my late grandmother, but my mother-in-law lost it at the hospital, got thrown out by security, broke a restraining order, got arrested, and now the whole family is blaming me for breaking everyone up. I never thought something as simple and sacred as naming my newborn would tear my family apart, but that's exactly what happened, and it started the day I gave birth to my daughter. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but looking back, it was the beginning of something that would break me in ways I still haven't fully recovered from, and I guess if I'm being honest, I should have seen the red flags with my mother-in-law long before that day, but I was so desperate to make things work, to be part of a family, to feel accepted, that I kept ignoring them, brushing them off as cultural differences or personality quirks or just her way of showing she cared, but deep down I knew she always wanted control. Control over my husband, over our home, over decisions that weren't hers to make, and maybe, most of all, over me. And still, I played along for the sake of peace, always telling myself I could handle it, that she'd come around, that love would be enough. But love wasn't enough, not when it came to her, and certainly not when it came to my daughter, because the moment she found out we weren't naming the baby after her, she completely lost it, and I don't just mean a few tears or some passive-aggressive remarks, I mean a full-blown meltdown right there in the hospital, just hours after I gave birth, while I was still shaking from labor and trying to hold my baby close to my chest, her tiny breath warm against my skin, still feeling like I was floating somewhere between pain and awe and disbelief that this little person was finally here, that she was real and mine and perfect, and then came the shouting. I can still hear it, her voice slicing through the quiet room, yelling about how ungrateful I was, how I had disrespected her legacy, how she had earned the right to have her name passed on, and my husband tried to calm her down. I saw him put his hand on her arm, whisper something, but she shook him off and turned her anger on me, standing over my bed, finger in my face, calling me a selfish b*tch who didn't understand family. And in that moment I didn't cry, I didn't yell back, I just sat there, stunned, clutching my baby a little tighter, my body aching, my heart racing, trying to figure out if this was really happening or if the exhaustion was messing with my head. And when the nurse walked in and asked her to leave, she screamed louder, and security had to be called, and I watched as she was escorted out of the maternity ward, kicking and shouting, and the other new mothers were staring, and I felt humiliated. Like I had done something wrong, like I had caused this disaster. By choosing to name my child after my own grandmother, a woman who had raised me with nothing but love and softness, who had taught me to braid my hair and bake bread and fight for what I believed in, and naming my baby after her had felt like a quiet way to honor her memory, to carry something of her forward into this next chapter of my life. But to my mother-in-law it was a betrayal, a rejection, a war. And the fallout from that moment in the hospital didn't end when she was dragged out by security. It only got worse from there, because 2 days later when we brought the baby home, she was waiting at our house, and she tried to act like nothing had happened, showing up with gifts and a weird smile, and I told my husband I wasn't comfortable letting her inside, that I needed time, that I was still shaken, and he said he understood, but I could see the tension in his face, the pull between me and his mother, the guilt he didn't know how to carry, and he told her to leave, gently. And she did, but the messages started the next morning. Long texts accusing me of poisoning her son against her, of turning her future granddaughter into a stranger, of ruining her life. And I wanted to block her, I really did, but my husband asked me not to, said it would only make things worse, so I muted her instead and tried to focus on bonding with my baby. Tried to protect that sacred little space I had created for us, but it was like she was always there, lurking in the background, making sure I could never fully relax, never fully enjoy those first precious weeks of motherhood. And then the unthinkable happened. She showed up again, this time at our pediatrician's office, uninvited, pretending it was some coincidence, and when I refused to let her hold the baby, she made a scene again, right there in the waiting room, and the receptionist had to ask her to leave, and that's when I told my husband enough was enough. That I needed boundaries, legal ones if necessary, and he didn't argue. He saw what I was going through. He saw how I was unraveling, how I was flinching at every knock on the door, losing sleep, crying in the shower, afraid to take my baby outside in case she was hiding somewhere nearby, and so we got a restraining order, and filing it was one of the hardest things I've ever done, because I knew what it would mean. I knew it would shatter our family in ways that might never be fixed, and I didn't do it lightly. But I did it to protect my daughter, to protect myself, to reclaim some sense of safety and control. And when she was served with the paperwork, she went ballistic again, calling everyone in the family, spreading lies about me, saying I was unstable, saying I had postpartum psychosis, saying I was trying to isolate my husband from his roots, and some people believed her, or at least they didn't want to get involved. And I felt the silent judgment of relatives who used to be warm but now kept their distance, and it hurt. It hurt more than I can explain, to lose so much just for doing what I thought was right, and then, 3 weeks after the order was filed, she violated it, showed up at our house again, pounding on the door, screaming through the glass, and I called the police, hands shaking, heart in my throat, and they came and arrested her, right there on our front lawn, and I wish I could say I felt vindicated, but all I felt was sick. Like something precious had been broken beyond repair, and I stood there, holding my baby, watching my husband watch his mother being taken away in handcuffs, and I knew something between us had changed forever. After she was arrested, everything slowed down, like the world had been muffled under a blanket, and for days afterward I walked through my own home in a daze, carrying the baby from room to room, trying to make her laugh, trying to feel normal, but my chest felt heavy and my stomach tight all the time, like I was constantly bracing for something else to fall apart, and the worst part was my husband barely spoke after it happened. He wasn't angry, not outwardly, but he was distant, quieter than usual, staying up late in the living room, just sitting in the dark or scrolling through his phone without saying anything, and I knew he was trying to process it all, to make sense of the fact that his mother had crossed the line so badly that I had no choice but to involve the law, and I didn't blame him for struggling, but I needed him to show up for me, for us, and it felt like instead he was drifting further away. And the house felt colder, lonelier, and I started to wonder if I'd done something wrong, if maybe I'd overreacted. But then I'd remember the fear, the way my fingers trembled when I dialed 911, the look in her eyes through the glass door like she was daring me to try and stop her, and I'd remind myself that I had to protect my child, even if it cost me everything else. And a few days later we got a call from his father, who up until then had stayed out of it, mostly quiet and neutral. But that day he was different, his voice hoarse, like he'd been crying, and he asked if he could come over, said he wanted to talk face to face. And we agreed, because honestly, I still held out some hope that someone, anyone, in that family could bring some sense of calm to the storm we were stuck in. And when he arrived, I saw it in his face before he even opened his mouth, the defeat, the exhaustion, the grief. And he told us that the arrest had changed everything, that my mother-in-law had been lying to everyone about what really happened, saying we'd ambushed her, set her up, turned the baby against her, and that when the truth came out, when people saw the restraining order, the police report, the neighbors' witness statements, he couldn't take it anymore, he said. I stood by her for years, but this is not the woman I married. And then he told us he was leaving her, had already packed a bag and moved in with his brother, and I was stunned. I couldn't believe it, and my husband just sat there, jaw clenched, staring at the floor, like he was trying to disappear, and part of me felt guilty, like I had broken up a marriage, like I had started a chain reaction I never meant to start, but another part of me, a quieter, tired part, felt some strange, reluctant relief that finally someone else could see what I'd been trying to say all along. That her behavior wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous, and when his father left that day, he hugged me, awkwardly, gently, like he didn't quite know how to do it but wanted me to know he didn't blame me, and it was the first time in weeks I felt seen by someone in that family. And later that night when I was rocking the baby to sleep, I asked my husband if he was okay, if he was angry with me, if he regretted anything, and he just shook his head and said quietly, I don't know what I feel anymore. And that broke my heart more than anything else, because I needed him to fight for us, to choose me, to tell me I did the right thing, but instead he just drifted into silence again, and our home began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of tension and unspoken words. And the nights got longer, lonelier, and there were times I'd wake up from dreams where his mother was standing over our baby's crib, just watching her. And I'd sit up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and check every lock on every door, and I started carrying pepper spray in the diaper bag, even though she was no longer allowed near us. And maybe that sounds paranoid, but when someone crosses a boundary so violently, you start to see shadows where there might not be any, and even though I had technically won, by getting the law involved. Emotionally, I felt like I was losing everything: my peace, my husband, my sense of safety. And then came the custody threats, veiled through relatives, passive, aggressive messages that she was going to fight for her rights, that she wouldn't let me cut her out of her granddaughter's life forever. And that terrified me, because she had money, connections, and even though I had every legal document on my side, I knew that in court things could get messy, that people can lie and manipulate and pretend to be something they're not, and I started documenting everything: screenshots, voicemails, timestamps. Just in case, just to be safe, and all the while, I was still trying to nurse, to sleep in 2-hour stretches, to hold my baby and make her feel loved and safe, even though I felt anything but safe myself. And one night my husband finally said it. He told me he felt like he was stuck between two worlds, that he didn't know how to be a good son and a good husband at the same time, and I told him he didn't have to be both. That he just had to be a good father now, and he said, "I don't know how." And I realized in that moment that he was grieving too. Not just his mother, but the illusion of the family he thought he had, and so we started therapy, not because we knew how to fix things, but because we didn't, and those first few sessions were hard and raw and full of silence and tears and long pauses. But slowly we began to talk again, to share the pain, to sit in it together instead of alone, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. And it reminded me that maybe, just maybe, we still had a chance to build something better. From the wreckage. The threats didn't stop, even after we started therapy, even after my husband and I began to find pieces of ourselves again, because my mother-in-law wasn't done, not by a long shot, and part of me had hoped that after the arrest, after her husband left her, after the family began to see the truth, she'd retreat, reflect, maybe even apologize, but instead she doubled down. Like she needed to prove that she still had power, that she could still make us pay, and a few weeks later, we got a letter. An actual letter from a lawyer, saying she intended to pursue visitation rights, claiming that as the child's grandmother, she had legal standing to seek contact, and I felt my hands go numb reading it, like the blood had drained from my fingers, and my first thought was not about court or evidence or legal battles, it was about my daughter's face, her soft little coos, her warm body curled into mine at night. And the sickening thought of her being forced into a relationship with someone who had terrified me, violated boundaries, screamed in my face when I was still bleeding from birth, and I broke down, completely, right there on the floor in our hallway, my back against the wall, the letter crumpled in my lap, sobbing in a way I hadn't let myself do for months, because it all came flooding in at once. The fear, the exhaustion, the helplessness, and the crushing sense that I might never be free of this woman, and my husband found me like that, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He sat down next to me and pulled me into him, let me cry into his shirt, and I felt his body shaking too, and I knew this was breaking him as much as it was breaking me, and we knew we had to act fast. So we found a family lawyer, a woman who had dealt with high conflict relatives before, and when we sat down in her office and explained everything, she didn't blink, just nodded and said, "This is more common than people think, and you're doing the right thing." And I don't know why, but hearing that we weren't crazy, that we weren't alone, made me feel like I could breathe again, just a little, and she explained what we needed to do, what kind of documentation would help, how we could prepare for court if it came to that, and she warned us that even though the odds were in our favor, especially given the restraining order and her arrest, it might still take time, and there was always a risk that a judge could grant supervised visits, and that possibility haunted me. The idea that someone with that much rage could be allowed anywhere near my child just because of blood ties, and the nights after that meeting were some of the darkest I've ever known, because I couldn't sleep without seeing courtrooms in my head, without hearing imaginary gavel bangs, without picturing my daughter being led into a room with someone who had already tried to destroy me, and every knock on the door startled me, every unknown number on my phone made my heart race. And I hated that she still had that kind of hold over my nervous system, over my daily life. And I started getting migraines, long and blinding ones that made it hard to even hold my baby some days, and I hated myself for that too, for not being stronger, for not being more resilient, and I blamed myself constantly. Was there something I could have done differently? Should I have called her what she wanted me to call her so that I could maintain the peace? Was it worth it? and I'd cycle between anger and guilt and back to guilt again until one morning, holding my baby on the porch, watching the sun rise while the world was still quiet, I realized I wasn't broken. I was exhausted, yes, and scared, but I was still here, still showing up, still choosing to protect my child every single day, and that was strength, not failure, and slowly I began to reclaim that truth. To let it settle in me like warmth after a long winter, and I started writing things down, journaling. Everything. Not just for court, but for me, because I needed to remember who I was in all this, not just a victim, not just a new mom in survival mode, but a woman who was standing up to something deeply wrong, and the more I wrote, the more clarity I found, and when the court date finally came, I felt ready. Not fearless, but ready, and standing in that courtroom, hearing her lawyer make these ridiculous claims about how close we supposedly were, how she just wanted to be part of her granddaughter's life, made my stomach turn, but I didn't flinch, I didn't cry, I just told the truth, calmly, clearly, with every documented incident laid out, and my husband backed me up fully, and I saw in the judge's eyes that she understood, that she saw through the performance, and when the ruling came back, denying her visitation due to repeated and escalating violations of safety and parental boundaries, I felt something lift off my chest that had been pressing there for months, and I wanted to cry, but instead I just held my baby closer, kissed the top of her head, and whispered thank you, thank you, thank you, because it was over, or at least that part of it was. And I knew we'd still have to deal with the emotional rubble, the awkward family dynamics, the people who stayed silent when it mattered most, but at least I had this legal protection, this acknowledgement that what she did was wrong, and as we left the courthouse, my husband took my hand in the parking lot and said, "I'm proud of you." And I realized I hadn't heard that from him in so long, and I didn't know how badly I'd needed to. After the court ruling, there was this strange stillness that settled over everything, not quite peace, but more like the quiet after a long, violent storm, when the wind finally stops but the air still smells like rain and broken branches litter the ground, and I didn't know what to do with that silence at first, because for months I had been living in crisis mode, my body coiled tight like a wire, and suddenly there was no next battle. No urgent threat, and it almost felt unnatural to let my guard down, like my brain didn't know how to stop scanning for danger, and I still checked the locks at night, still startled at sudden noises, but somewhere deeper inside me, I felt something beginning to unclench, and that was the beginning of healing, though I didn't recognize it at the time, and in that space, my relationship with my husband began to shift too, because for the first time in a long time, we weren't just reacting. We were choosing, and he started to show up differently. Not just in the big ways, like attending therapy or standing beside me in court, but in the small, everyday ways that actually matter more, like asking me how I slept, rubbing my back when I was too tired to speak, folding laundry without being asked, sitting with me in the stillness without trying to fix it, and those moments slowly stitched together something fragile but real between us again. And one night while we were feeding the baby dinner, he looked at her, and then looked at me and said, "You're such a good mom." And I had to turn away so he wouldn't see the tears that filled my eyes, because for so long I had felt like I was barely holding it together, like I was faking strength I didn't have, and to hear that, from him, finally, meant more than he'll ever know, and still, not everything was fixed, because emotional damage doesn't vanish just because legal boundaries are in place, and there were moments, especially around the baby's first milestones. Her first smile, her first steps, her first birthday, where I felt this dull ache, this absence that wasn't about missing my mother-in-law but about mourning what could have been, if only she had chosen love over control, inclusion over ego, because deep down I had wanted her to be part of our lives. I really had. I had imagined holidays with her holding our daughter, laughter in the kitchen. Little moments of warmth passed between generations, and it was hard to let go of that vision, to accept that some people simply cannot, or will not, change. And I remember one afternoon sitting on the floor with my daughter, watching her play with blocks, her tiny fingers fumbling with the pieces, her whole face focused, and I thought about the kind of world I wanted to build for her, a world where love was safe, where family meant support, not fear, and that became my new focus, not just surviving but building something healthier, stronger. And I started reaching out again. To old friends I distanced myself from during the worst of it, to cousins and coworkers and people who had shown me quiet kindness through it all, and little by little, we created a new version of family, not defined by blood or obligation but by mutual respect, boundaries, and real affection. And it was around that time that my husband and I finally had the hard conversation about his mother. What we'd tell our daughter one day, if we'd ever open that door again, and we sat on the porch after. She fell asleep, the monitor between us, the night breeze brushing over us like a balm, and I told him I didn't want to live in bitterness, that I wasn't trying to erase his mother from our lives entirely, but that I needed him to understand that trust, once broken like that, doesn't just regenerate, and he nodded, and he said something I didn't expect. He said he didn't want our daughter to grow up thinking silence was the same as peace, and I knew then that he got it, finally, that he understood that the cost of pretending everything was okay had nearly destroyed us, and we agreed that if she ever reached out again, really reached out, not with threats or guilt, but with remorse and accountability, then maybe, just maybe, we'd have that conversation again, but only if it felt right, and only on our terms, and that felt like a boundary that honored both our truths. And after that night, things became gentler, not perfect, but softer around the edges, and I started laughing more, dancing around the kitchen with the baby, taking long walks again without scanning every corner like I was being hunted, and slowly I came back to myself, or maybe I came into a newer version of myself, one that was tougher but also more tender, one that knew how to say no without apology, how to ask for help without shame, and how to protect what mattered most without setting myself on fire just to keep someone else warm. And in time, I stopped talking about my mother-in-law entirely, not because I was avoiding the pain, but because she no longer held power over my days, my thoughts, or my future, and I knew I had done the right thing. Even when it felt like the loneliest choice in the world, because I had taught my daughter, without even knowing it, what it looks like to draw a line and say, this is where love ends and control begins, and I will not allow you to cross it, no matter who you are. Time has a strange way of softening the sharp edges of pain without ever fully erasing the shape of it, and now, nearly 2 years since that day in the hospital when everything cracked open, I look at my daughter, running through the backyard with grass stains on her knees, her giggle floating through the air like a melody I never want to stop hearing, and I realize just how far we've come, and how much I've changed. Not just in the obvious ways motherhood transforms you, but in the quiet, bone-deep ways that only surviving something deeply traumatic can. And when I think about that version of me, the one sitting in that hospital bed, trembling, bleeding, terrified, holding her baby while being screamed at by a woman who should have been a source of comfort, I want to reach back through time and hold her hand, tell her she's not crazy, that she's not overreacting, that her instincts are right and her boundaries are sacred, and that no one, no matter their title or relation, has the right to violate them. And maybe if someone had told me that back then, really told me that, and meant it, I wouldn't have spent so many sleepless nights second-guessing myself, swallowing my fear, trying to rationalize the irrational just to keep the peace. And there's something about becoming a mother that forces you to reckon with your own boundaries in a way nothing else ever has, because suddenly you're not just protecting yourself anymore, you're protecting someone who trusts you completely, who learns the world through your eyes, who absorbs the energy around them like a sponge. And I knew I never wanted my daughter to see me shrinking, flinching, accommodating cruelty under the disguise of family obligation, and over time, that clarity became my compass. Not anger, not revenge, not bitterness, just clarity, and that clarity is what carried me through the aftermath, through the therapy, the strained relationships, the uncomfortable family gatherings where certain chairs sat noticeably empty, where some people offered quiet support while others kept their distance, too afraid to pick a side, and I stopped needing everyone to understand. Stopped trying to explain myself to people who were more invested in maintaining appearances than in asking what really happened, and that was a kind of freedom I never expected to find, the freedom of letting go of people who only show up when it's convenient or safe, and instead, I invested in the people who showed up in the dark, in the messy, in the honest spaces where real love lives. And yes, we still have scars, emotional ones, relational ones. And sometimes they ache when old memories resurface, especially around the baby's birthday or on holidays when the absence of certain faces is louder than the presence of others. But we've created new traditions now, new rituals, and my daughter knows love, deep and consistent and safe love, and she doesn't ask about her grandmother yet, she's too young to understand, but one day she will, and when she does, I'll tell her the truth. not to make her afraid or to pass on my wounds, but to teach her that love must include respect, and that family is not defined by guilt or obligation but by how people treat you when it matters most. And I'll tell her that her name is a legacy of strength, named after a woman who lived with quiet dignity, who taught me how to stand tall even when the world tried to shrink me. And I'll tell her that her mother fought not just for her safety, but for her right to grow up in a home where no one walks on eggshells, where tears are met with empathy, not punishment, and where women are not punished for saying no. And as for my husband, our journey hasn't been easy, and there were moments I wondered if we'd make it through, if the pressure and pain would swallow us whole, but we did make it. Because he did the work, because he chose us over tradition, over denial, over comfort, and because he learned how to listen with his whole heart, not just his ears. And our marriage now is not what it was before. It's deeper, humbler, more honest, and sometimes healing looks like learning to sit in discomfort together, to have hard conversations without running away, and that's what we're doing, still, one day at a time. And if my mother-in-law ever reaches out again, I don't know what I'll say. Or if I'll say anything at all, because I don't carry hate for her, but I also don't carry space for her anymore, not in my life, not in my child's life, not in the world we've worked so hard to rebuild from the rubble. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. That sometimes the people who hurt us the most never say sorry, never change, never understand the damage they've done, and we have to heal anyway, we have to move forward anyway. And so I have, not perfectly, not without scars, but fully and completely in my own time, and as I watched my daughter grow, wild and curious and unafraid, I know I've done something right, even if I had to walk through fire to do it.